Transcoastal Adaptation Center for Nature-Based Solutions at St. Mary's University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The treaties of peace and friendship were signed in 1725 with the British Crown and the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik peoples. And the treaty did not deal with the surrender of land, but instead was intended to be an ongoing relationship between nations. The webinar today is brought to you by Transcoastal Adaptation Center for Nature-Based Solutions and the Stewardship Center for BC. So Transcoastal Adaptations, or TCA, is a center for nature-based solutions at St. Mary's. We work to transform landscapes for coastal resilience through increasing our local capacity within various sectors like NGOs, industry and academia, and in implementing nature-based shoreline projects. The Stewardship Center for BC's mission is to strengthen ecological stewardship by providing educational, technical, and capacity programs and resources to organizations, governments, the private sector, and the general public through collaborative partnerships. So we're both nonprofit organizations, and we're looking to help people understand, enjoy, and sustain healthy ecosystems through projects and programs like Green Shores. So today, we're looking at the topic of applying nature-based solutions in the foreshore areas. Before we get started on the actual presentations, I would like to just send a big shout out to our funders over here. So we're grateful for all of these funders and partners, as well as our in-kind partners, such as the Green Shores Technical Advisory Committee, and as well as project advisory committees for Green Shores as well. So we are working with universities, provinces, the federal government, as well as some international groups in North America. So before we keep going with the presentations, I just want to make sure everyone knows that Green Shores is a framework for designing and applying nature-based approaches to shoreline management. It promotes a better understanding and importance of healthy shorelines because people protect what they know and love. So it helps communities to adapt to things like climate change and protects the social or the ecological and socioeconomic values of the shoreline. So the guiding principles that we want you to keep in mind for today are to preserve or restore physical processes, maintain or enhance habitat function and diversity, prevent or reduce pollutants from entering the aquatic environment, and to avoid or reduce cumulative impacts through design guidance, project certification, Green Shores training, as well as communities of practice and approved professionals in the communities we're working in. So if you're not familiar with Green Shores training, level 1 is a one-day workshop where we introduce participants to the program, overview shoreline ecology and governance, get into some of the credits and rating system fits, as well as a visit to a local shoreline. And then level 2 kind of expands on the knowledge of level 1 in a 2-day workshop where you get in-depth knowledge of the Green Shores credits and rating systems, and you get actual hands-on experience applying the Green Shores credits and rating systems through desktop and field exercises and applying it on the ground. So that's sort of an overview of the Green Shores program. I'm going to introduce you now to our two presenters for today. So Cori Barraclough, as a freshwater ecologist, project manager, and co-founder at Aquatech Scientific Consulting Limited, Cori helps local governments in British Columbia to manage and protect their community's water resources in a cost-effective, feasible, and responsible way. Cori understands that the importance of working in tandem with nature, while accounting for the real-world influences of social palatability, timing, and funding. She integrates ecological research, urban management, and local regulation in her recommendations that help municipalities and developers navigate provincial law, protect water quality, educate and secure grant funding, as well as preventing waste. On the other coast, on the East Coast, we have Dr. Donna Marie Bilkovic, She is a marine ecologist and a professor at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science at William and Mary, and assistant director of the Center for Coastal Resources Management. She specializes in evaluating the ecological and sociocultural functions of nature-based approaches for shoreline protection, along with their capacity to act as estuarine habitat conservation strategies. She is also the lead editor of the book Living Shorelines, The Science and Management of Nature-Based Coastal Protection. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Donna Marie Bilkovic, and she's going to give our first presentation about living shorelines.
Thank you, Kelly. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to be here and share some of my experiences researching nature-based coastal protection. They're typically called living shorelines in the US, so I will probably flip back and forth between those two terms. And much of my work is centered on living shoreline projects within the mid-Atlantic coast of the US, but many of these practices I'm going to describe are used up and down the eastern seaboard. So within our East Coast bays and estuaries, there is a continuum of shoreline protection approaches that are commonly being used, and this figure shows some of them. And these options really range from conserving natural features, so on the far left of the diagram, the things like marshes, beaches, dunes that provide that natural capacity to protect our shoreline and slow erosion. And then on the far right is the conventional hardening approaches like bulkhead seawalls and riprap revetment. And then in the middle are these categories that combine nature and engineering. And the category of living shoreline, so the second bucket there, is, like I said, the term that's commonly used in the US, and definitions may vary very slightly, but generally the concept is there's two main things. One, the natural elements should dominate. So whatever your native ecosystem is, whether it be a mangrove or a marsh or an oyster reef, that should dominate. And secondly, the land-water connection needs to be maintained. And this is, often this is kind of glossed over. This is the critical component if you want your shoreline to remain dynamic and very responsive to changing water levels and sea level rise. And it's the traditional approaches, the conventional approaches that are static, and they don't have that ability to be as responsive to those climate change events. And so there's another category, or within the living shorelines bucket, there's a whole array of different designs that vary depending on your wave climate. So as you increase in energy, there's a need for an additional or larger engineered features to help attenuate the waves and break the waves and allow your ecosystem to establish. And this other bucket is being more commonly used as shoreline enhancement. And so this is in areas where you have armoring and there's a desire to perhaps green it up or add some ecological uplift, and folks have been trying all different kinds of things like floating islands on seawalls or adding marsh plantings to riprap revetment and adding structural complexity to seawalls in order to encourage biota to settle. But you still have your static armored features, so these will remain less resilient in the long run to sea level rise and storms. So in the US, there's been, I would say, a pretty rapid shift in shoreline management policy in just the past couple decades. We have now seen all of our coastal states having policies that either encourage, endorse, or require living shorelines where suitable for erosion control. And 2/3 of the coastal states, of the 21 coastal states, have formal regulations or statutes. And we actually have 3 states that require living shorelines where suitable. The federal agencies have also joined in the fund, and they've either issued guidance on how to use living shorelines or why to use living shorelines, or they've adopted some incentives like general permits that expedite the process. The two of the states that require living shorelines are the Chesapeake Bay states, Maryland and Virginia, and I come from Virginia. And they were really the early adopters of living shorelines, the first to put them in the US in the 70s and 80s. And what was placed resembles a lot of the projects that we put in today. So it was a planted fringing marsh with the use of a stone wave break. In concert with the policy change, there's also been other things implemented that have really helped speed up the acceptance of these living shorelines. So there's been incentives. Different states have different incentives. A very popular one in my state is a cost share program, where the state will pay for a portion of the project for a property owner. And then there's a lot of NGOs and community groups that are now very actively engaged in increasing the sort of awareness of these projects, as well as constructing them in their local areas. So we've seen this increase in use of living shorelines, but the living shoreline implementation rates still remain lower than what they could be. And this is largely because the majority of our US coastline is privately owned. So we face this hurdle where decisions are being made by individuals, and of course humans are messy. And our research is showing that many property owners are still either unaware or unconvinced that living shorelines are as protective as armoring. So there's still work that needs to be done to demonstrate that these projects can be protective. So after a lot of trial and error in the early years and lessons learned, this led to the development of some rules of thumb that on sort of where to place the projects and what types of project designs to use where. And this table is an example of one that was derived from the Chesapeake Bay by a colleague of mine, Walter Priest. That is a chapter in the book Living Shorelines that was mentioned. And so essentially he took many of the physical properties that you would look at when you're evaluating a shoreline, such as fetch and nearshore depths and tidal range. And he created a table where you can sum those up, and they get placed into three major buckets of either a low energy type setting, medium energy, or high energy. The low energy setting is where you would, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the low energy setting would be where you plant a marsh and have like a very small wave break, such as a bagged oyster shell or a biodegradable fiber core log. In medium energies is where you need a more substantial engineered feature, like these stone sills that run parallel to the marsh are very popular in the Chesapeake Bay. They're used in a lot of places, as well as oyster reef structures are beginning to be used in some of these higher energy settings. And then finally, in the highest energy setting, you would place a larger offshore breakwater system and enhance the beach and do some plantings. And those are the primary kind of approaches with tweaks in the design that are being used in our area. So we took much of this information on the physical properties you would use to evaluate conditions, as well as other things we learned over the years, and we developed a decision tool in which this is for Virginia, in which you could zoom in to your shoreline or type in your address and see what type of approach would be appropriate for your shoreline, whether it be armoring or different types of living shorelines. And we've been working with partners in other coastal states as well to adopt a similar suitability model for those states. So if you're interested in that, you can, that's the website of DepVA where our tool is housed. So I wanted just to share a couple examples of successful projects in my area, and then point to a few things that we're still investigating to try and improve. So the first is an example where my institute is located. VIMS is on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay. This is a point of land. It's called Gloucester Point. It's a very high energy shoreline. And you can see before construction, our beach was almost non-existent. And this is our boat basin. This is where we house all our research vessels. So this became alarming. And after Hurricane Isabel, it was decided we needed to do something. So a plan was developed to create this offshore breakwater beach system. And that's it following construction. And to show you a few of the images. So this is what the beach looked like shortly before construction. You can see one of our buildings there. This is during construction or just after placement of sand and some of the stone. And then we planted native grasses, marsh grasses. And this is what it looks like now. So this project has now been in place for 14 years. The vegetation came in really nicely. It's way denser than I expected it to be. And this has already weathered many storms. We've been very happy with this, this project. The second example is located in a rural area on the western shore of the Chesapeake Bay in Virginia. It's in a moderate energy setting, but it has a lot of boating activity. And the upper panels show 2013 is prior to build. You can see there's no marsh left there. And then 2015 is just a year after construction. So this site is a public landing. And it was used by a lot of rowing clubs. And so they wanted to, in their design, they wanted to maintain this sandy beach area in between the low profile rock sills that you can see here in order to allow them to get their canoes and kayaks in and out of the water easily. This was also turned into a public demonstration site. And this is it in 2021. You can see the marsh is fully established. And I've been monitoring the site since it was constructed. I actually helped build it. It was the first one I actually helped build. And it was only planted with 2 species, and there's been a lot of wild colonization of it's very diverse now. The marsh is very diverse. And it's functioning in a very similar way to a nearby reference marsh. We also placed these bagged oyster shell around a point of land that was in over here, a slightly lower energy part of that shoreline. And within the first month, oysters were recruiting, and this has really expanded nicely into a beautiful reef. It's one of the best reefs I've seen. Okay, so then another common design makes use of constructed oyster reefs in the intertidal as opposed to the rock. And here there remains this trade-off between the ecological goals of oyster growth and the engineering goals to stabilize the shoreline. So of course the oysters prefer to be underwater at least 50% of the time so they can feed. And whereas if you have your structures emergent, you're going to have greater protection. And there's been a lot of experimentation on different configurations and placement and materials to see how we can best meet both of those goals. This is an example of an oyster castle sill project. So these are relatively lightweight, prefabricated concrete units that interlock and can be stacked. They're popular because volunteers can easily place these projects. You don't need any mechanized equipment. And this example comes from a group called the Elizabeth River Project, which is located in Norfolk, Virginia, a very urban setting. And they have placed a large number of these projects along their urban shorelines. This one you can see planted in 2018, a year later, very well established plants. And then in 2023, lots of oyster growth already happening on the sill structure. So there's a growing number of oyster reef materials to select from. So new companies seem to be coming on board every day with new innovations, which is really exciting. Some of them are shown here. You have your reef balls, which come in all different sizes. Again, the oyster castles, there's an example of hardscape, which interlocks as well. There's these table structures, and the bagged oyster shell that's really just scratching the surface on what's out there. As these new innovations come online, this is where the science lags a little bit. So, it's hard to keep up with testing all these new things. It's important to get them in, but we also need to be evaluating how effective they are for shore protection and oyster growth. It's always discouraging to have a project fail, so we want to make sure that we're not sending the wrong message to property owners. So in addition to some sort of basic considerations for these projects, such as are there oysters in the area, which would indicate the right conditions for salinity and potential larval sources, it's also important to consider things like the timing. So placing these projects out while the oysters are in the water and ready to settle is critical. Otherwise, they become biofouled and then the oysters can't settle. It has to be designed for the wave energy, right? So making sure like these types of oyster castles are for sort of lower energy settings, and bottom type. So if you have a really muddy bottom, you're going to need to prep that shoreline, and filter cloth is often put down to reduce the sinking that might happen. Okay, so now everyone's excited. Chesapeake Bay loves oysters, so everyone's excited about oysters. They want to put them everywhere, and there's now this desire to use these oyster reef structures in relatively high energy settings where you would typically put maybe a rock sill, possibly an offshore breakwater. So this is one example of a pilot effort. This company Natrix is placing these exoforms. You can see they're quite large. In this instance, you do need equipment to stack them. And they place it along about 1,000 feet of shoreline of this island, Hog Island. And they're now monitoring to see how well it will perform, both for protecting the shoreline and stabilizing the marsh, as well as capturing oysters. So that's a story to watch. I put a link to one of their web pages. And I wanted to just share one sort of ecosystem deficiency that we've discovered and we're working to remedy now. First, the good news is that we and others have documented that generally within just a few years, the plant production and the fish and wildlife use of these living shorelines is equivalent to reference marshes. The soils can take longer to develop, the soil and nutrient and organic carbon content, because in many of these projects they're starting with clean sand fill. So it just takes longer for the organics to build up. But the deficiency we noted was this absence or very low abundance of Atlantic rib mussels, which are really important salt marsh filter feeders. And the rim mussel is native to the Atlantic coast from the southern Gulf of St. Lawrence to Florida. So it's very widespread. It has a wide salinity preference. It settles in these really large aggregates around the cordgrass, the Spartina alterniflora. And it actually has a mutualistic relationship with the plants. So the plants provide shade, so it reduces the animal's heat stress, and then they can attach to the plant so they're secure in the marsh. And the plant or the mussels have really rich biodeposits, and so it fertilizes the plants. So they both benefit. And when the mussels are there, they provide a whole array of ecosystem services. Importantly, they're super efficient filter feeders, and they enhance nitrogen removal in the marshes. So we definitely want them to be populating the marshes. So there's a few things we're exploring to figure out kind of what is contributing to their absence. And the first is the rock sill maybe interrupting the ability of the larvae to make it to the surface of the marsh when they're settling. And we do see animals settling, a decent number of animals settling on rock sills. And so we conducted a little experiment where we placed these dish scrubbers on the surface of the living shoreline marsh, as well as a paired natural marsh. We did this for 3 months at 4 different sites. And we noted that indeed there were 8 times lower mussel settlement in the living shorelines compared to the natural marshes. So the larvae are there. There's a larval supply. Some are making it to the surface, but not in much lower numbers in the natural marsh. Other things we're looking at is the sand desiccating and causing some mortality? Is the absence of adults perhaps reducing settlement queues? And are the sort of low plant densities in the early years contributing as a lower habitat quality? So far, our data is showing no effect with the planting. We're still exploring these other things, and my graduate student Ashley Rose is doing this work for her dissertation. So just a few takeaways. The science is suggesting that living shorelines can really be effective at both protection and providing these ecosystem services. We now have many examples of projects that are, nearing in their second decade, and they're doing quite well, and they've weathered many storms. It's important when we're assessing these projects to remember that not everything's going to develop at the same pace. And a really important thing that's coming up is the need to demonstrate to property owners that living shorelines are protective and resilient, and in order to increase their use and acceptance. And finally, this sort of best practices for implementation. I think we share a lot of successes, but it's really helpful to hear about failures. So like, what have people tried that doesn't work? So we're not doing the same thing, or, how can we best learn from each other? And we often, no one wants to share their failures, right? So I would applaud people sharing failures. And lastly, that we're working with nature and engineering. So the best projects are going to be ones where we're working together on those projects. So I will leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions now, or if you think of anything later, my contact info is up there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Donna. If you don't mind taking down your screen, and we'll get Cori to share her screen, and we'll take comments and questions at the very end. But if you do have comments or questions throughout, feel free to pop them into the chat.
Can we see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Great. Well, thanks, Donna. That was a really inspiring presentation, and I wish I could say that I have as much interesting research to share as you do. I'm a consultant, and so I do work with the University of Victoria on the freshwater side of things, but spend most of my time dealing with homeowners and trying to solve their issues. So what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today is just how some of these practical considerations come into play when we start talking about incentives to get homeowners to do something a little differently. Oops. So our challenge here is much the same as I think many people have, and that is we have this legacy of hard armored shorelines, especially when it comes to our feeder bluffs, which we seem to be losing quite rapidly. So we take shorelines that look lovely and turn them into something that looks much like this, typical, stairways, seawalls, etc. We're also seeing a lot of stronger winter storms. Many of these properties were developed 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. The seawalls are starting to fail, and people are really fearful of losing properties or losing homes, even in some cases. Something which might be a little bit different on this part of the West Coast is that we have very, very high property values. So a lot of the homes that we're looking at here are in the multiple millions of dollars. So, and a lot of the people who live in these homes tend to be retired or toward the end of their career. They're the only ones that seem to be able to afford them. But it also means that a lot of their retirement savings are tied up in these houses. And so there's a lot of concern around shoreline erosion. The other challenge that we've got in the province is very long processing times for a lot of our Crown land permits. So where we are, if you want to do work below the present natural boundary, then you need permission from the province to do that work, whether that's a tenure to put a permanent structure or whether that's a temporary use permit. You still have to go through the process. And just due to some staffing issues that we've got provincially, the system is really backlogged. So for instance, if you wanted to put, a hard structure, like a set of stairs or a dock or something in, you could be looking at in excess of 6 or so years to get that processed. And I know that the local office recently shared that they've got a backlog upwards of 800 applications. So through no fault of staff, we just have this huge backlog that we have to deal with. So one of the questions became, how do we incentivize a shift toward nature-based projects that could be expedited through this permit process? And through a lot of hard work between a lot of people, including the province and the Stewardship Council, there's a program called the Nature-Based Shoreline Pilot Program. And this began in 2022 and is intended to speed up this process of getting these permits. And the idea being that if you've got a soft shore or living shoreline type of project that meets certain criteria, that your application could be processed, kind of go to the head of the line and be processed more quickly, and that would be an incentive for people to take a softer approach. So in order to qualify, I won't get into the details. There's other people on the call that could speak to that much more eloquently than I could. But some of the key pieces are that your project cannot have a revetment that covers more than 30% of the shoreline. You can't infringe on critical habitat or block public access, and the project still needs to support natural processes such as sediment transport. So I'd like to drill down into a project that we've been working on in my office recently, and it's quite a challenging one. This is Cordova Bay in Saanich. This air photo just gives you a bit of a sense of what the landscape looks like. You can see that the shoreline is very heavily developed, but what you cannot see is the extent of the hard armoring. So in this area, we have a number of known issues. We've got many seawall failures happening. And in my office, we get a phone call probably every month from somebody, not necessarily just in this area, but often in this area, asking us to please help fix their seawall problem, whether that's come in and do a habitat assessment or whether that's to help them work through the permitting process. The calls are frequent. In this particular case, because there's so many seawalls, we have a real lack of sediment, natural sediment supply. And this has been an ongoing issue for many decades. So in the case of this project, we have 4 adjacent properties with existing foreshore tenures, and they have actively failing seawalls that are getting worse all the time. So this is the scenario, and this is sort of an extreme case, but you can see that it's very, very heavily armored. These are the 4 properties that are adjacent to one another. And you can see on the foreshore that we've got these little yellow signs. Some have been placed by homeowners and some have been placed by the municipality because the seawall is actively failing and there's a concern about public safety. This is a very popular beach. It is one of the only off-leash dog beaches in the area. And you can see that it's a beautiful area. So people like to be down on the beach, and it's not necessarily a safe place to be if the seawalls are crumbling. You can see where this orange circle is, where the stones have actually kicked out of the bottom of the wall. They've tried to put some rebar in to sort of hold things together. And then if you look further to the right, you can see the concrete that was poured a number of years ago to try and tie the seawall together. Unfortunately, not successfully. The challenge is, what do we do with a scenario like this when, if we look south, we can see that the shoreline is armored pretty much as far as we can see. It's a little bit greener on the upslope, but the toe of the slope is pretty heavily armored. And if we look to the north, we see the same thing, only in this case, there's a lot more concrete and a lot less revetment. The area where the graffiti is on the seawall is actually a Saanich park, this local municipal park. And this area is also armored. And this is just the way things were done when all of these properties were built. So not really anybody's fault. People just didn't know any better. So what do we do with this particular site? So we were called in to help on this project well over a year ago, when there was still lots of questions on what could be done. And we weren't able to really progress a good solution. So we asked, okay, is there a different way of doing this? Is there an opportunity for a more nature-based solution? This is a high energy site. So this photo is actually from elsewhere on the shoreline, but looking seaward. So you can see there's a pretty good fetch here. We have 4 adjacent properties, so that's a good opportunity. The owners are already working together. We've got a recognized emergency, and I think a soft shore approach, or a softer shore approach, is well aligned with what the municipality would like to see. So we approached the homeowners and said, you know, is this something that you would consider? And they all said, yes, this sounds like a great idea, but they were really keen on the expedited permit side of things. So, oh, Peter, go the right way. My mouse is not behaving. So some of the challenges that we have are that we really need to get this work done quickly. The photo that's in the background of the blue tarp covering the seawall was a photo from this last winter. The tarp was placed to try and keep the rainwater and the sea spray from getting behind the rocks and worsening an existing situation. We actually have a tension crack all the way along the shoreline now. So this wall is giving way. And we are concerned that extra water behind the wall was going to cause additional subsidence. I think too that psychologically, not just these homeowners, but many homeowners feel that if a hard option has already failed, the inclination is to build a stronger, harder wall, not to reverse course and go to a softer solution. And I think another challenge with this is that the softer shore or nature-based solutions are not well understood, even by a lot of professionals. And there's a concern that if you design something that's a soft shore approach and it doesn't work, that you could be held professionally responsible for that. And whether that's a realistic fear or not, I think it's a very real one. The other concern here is that anything we do, especially on this piece of shoreline, is going to be really expensive. Access is really difficult. And so trying to do any kind of work is going to be very costly. And the homeowners have already spent a lot of money. They don't have a lot of, most homeowners don't have a lot of extra cash. A lot of their assets are tied up in their houses. I think this is true for a lot of people. So we can't get it wrong. It can't fail. And the other piece is that there's not a lot of examples to point to. So we can't just take the homeowners by the hand and walk them down the beach and say, look at what your neighbor did. Look at this beautiful green shoreline that worked for them and it should work for you. So it's really hard to convince people to go this route when there aren't really clear examples that we can point to. So homeowners' fears tend to be being a bit of a guinea pig, or being on what we call the bleeding edge rather than the leading edge, in that it can be very costly to go first. The other piece is, of course, that homeowners don't want to give up land. It's not unique to this particular situation. People like their decks, they like their views, they want to be looking out over the water, and they don't want to retreat. But the other side of that is that if they don't do something, they're going to lose the land anyway, and often with much greater consequence. And then another issue that's come up is the one of insurance. So if they do something and it's the wrong thing, are they going to be insured? If they don't do the right thing, or they don't do anything, are they going to be insured? And this is something that I think is kind of weighing on people. It's not something that's been well addressed formally by the insurance agencies. The other piece is when you look up and down the shoreline and all you see is hard armoring in either direction, we unfortunately don't have policies like the one that Donna spoke about, where there are incentives or there's actually rules about putting in new hard armoring. We simply don't have that in the areas where I work. So there's really not that consistent push to change the way things are done. So given those challenges, we asked ourselves, is there yet another option that we can consider? So this is one of more of a hybrid design. And as it turns out, the nature-based shoreline pilot program does have a provision for hybrid design, which does include some of these hard shore elements. So things like rock structures or groins or revetments. And that's something that would need to be designed by a professional and have a supporting rationale. But the program obviously realized that this could be something that was necessary. So we looked at what could we possibly do here that kind of bridges the gap between the fully soft shore approach and this really extremely hard armored approach. So one of the solutions that we've thought about is there a way that we could do a partial revetment, potentially with some kind of beach nourishment and some planting? Under that, we would try to keep the revetment within the existing footprint and then put the soft shore elements on Crown land. And that would allow us to take advantage of the expedited approval process for that. But then we start getting into some questions. And this is where I'm not trying to be really negative about the program, not at all. I think it's a fantastic program. But I think we have a number of questions that we need to work through if we're going to make this work on a practical level and convince homeowners. And that is, how much armoring is too much? Under the nature-based shoreline requirements, 30% is the target for a softer shore approach. Is that enough for extreme exposure areas like this? Is that too much? And then the question of, once we actually build something like this, let's just take, for example, a revetment that has, say, beach nourishment seaward of that. If we have that beach gravel washed away and we get left with the revetment, have we really moved the needle? Have we really changed anything? And what provisions do we have for ensuring that that's going to stay in place over time? So the way that our policies work, we don't really have any enforcement mechanisms. And the province doesn't have the resources to be able to go and inspect on a regular basis or sort of police the situation. So if we give people the opportunity to do hard armoring and then hope that we can put some soft shore elements that are going to be maintained, how do we ensure that that continues to be the case over the long term? And then from a really practical point of view, when you have this many properties all in a row that are all armored and you've lost a lot of those natural processes, what processes are in place to try and naturally replenish some of those sands and gravels that are needed to maintain the shoreline? Is that even possible? So this has kind of led me to reflect on where we can go from here and how we can continue to push this forward. Can we go from a fully hardened shore to a soft shore in one step? And I would suggest that the answer to that is probably no. It seems to me, after trying this on a number of projects and discussions with lots of other colleagues, that this is a really big leap. So is hybrid the answer that we need? Maybe. I wish we had some of the policies and the research in place that Donna's got available to her. We've got some of that here, but we don't have the same sort of community and the same sort of support. And so one of my questions was, is there a way that we can get the municipality more proactively involved? I was really interested to see Donna's tool where they've got the shoreline mapped and they've got it color coded and they've got some recommendations and some studies. And I think that's exactly what we need here. Is we need to be able to say, okay, let's pool some resources, whether those are provincial resources, which are few, or whether those are municipal resources, or whether we have a special tax levy just for a particular region. Can we pool the resources and do some studies that give us the baseline information we need to inform different options for the shoreline? Because we know that these failures are going to keep happening, and we know it's costing millions of dollars to keep fixing these things one little piece at a time. So how can we actually work together as a community to solve some of this problem and get the shoreline back in the condition that we'd all like to see it in? And I'd just like to share a couple of thoughts that I have around how we can sort of tackle some of these issues. And it seems to me that risk and liability seem to be the stumbling blocks that we keep tripping over. So from the homeowner's perspective, the financial risk of being an early adopter is paramount in their mind. But also, when you talk to homeowners who live along eroding shorelines, they are fearful. And oftentimes it comes across as anger, but they are really scared that they're going to lose something. They're scared they're going to lose, their home or their property, or that their safety is at risk, or that the public on the beach are at risk and that they're going to be sued. So there's a lot of fear around this, and I don't know how we get around that, but I think it's important to understand that it is often coming from a place of fear. And with regard to the other professionals, oftentimes, again, there's a concern of a professional liability or professional risk, which could also translate into a reputational risk, a business risk. And so we need to somehow figure out how we're going to lessen that risk. With respect to the province, again, as I spoke, it's difficult to say, okay, if we permit this hybrid option where we have a revetment and we've got soft shores, what guarantee is it that we're not just going to end up with the same old armoring once we're done? What measures can we put in place, and what's actually within our authority to put in place to make sure that some of these pieces stay in the long term? And in terms of getting everybody together on the same page, the municipality is the logical agency to do that. But as soon as they start doing things like that, then people push back and say, you can't tell me what to do on my property. And they tend to oppose things that would ask them to do something different. So there's a political risk to that. So just to sort of summarize my perspective on this, and I stress it's only one perspective of many, I do think this nature-based shoreline approval process, this expedited process, is an excellent first step. It's absolutely what we need. I think had some good success on some projects already, but for some of these more difficult situations, I think there's a lot of practical details that we need to work out. I know that the Stewardship Center and others are doing some great work to educate other professionals, but I think as professionals, we need to educate each other, sort of cross-discipline. Ecologists and engineers and coastal geoscientists need to work more closely together and try to figure out how to answer some of these problems. We do need some local government leadership. Some provincial leadership would be lovely as well. I'd love to see a program like what Donna has in her area. And we need to take a more regional approach. So in the freshwater environment, we talk about a watershed approach, but we rarely talk about that, except in little groups like this, about how we manage entire shorelines as a unit. And I think if we were to do that, that would reduce some of the perceived risks and liabilities that homeowners have and encourage them to go in the right direction. So that's my perspective, sort of from the front lines and being a consultant and having to answer the questions directly with homeowners. And I hope that others on the call have some suggestions as to how we might overcome some of these challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cori. That's really excellent. And I appreciate your sort of reflections on what we need and what we want to look for.